Hello, and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today, I'm going to be talking about fetter length, specifically how it can influence the execution and application of your techniques. Now, one of the difficult parts about talking about this is that obviously everyone has a different set of techniques that they use and utilize in fencing. And the thing about it is that if you maybe have some advantages in your particular style with a longer or heavier fetter, that's not going to look the same as someone who maybe fences completely differently and what kinds of advantages they might get out of a shorter and faster fetter. But generally, the concept of fetter length goes along those lines. The longer they are, the heavier they are, and the better they are at things like stabbing or getting good bind presence. Whereas the shorter they are, the faster they are, and the better they are at usually parry, riposte kinds of defensive cuts. Now, overall, this can be completely different in completely different people's hands, but the footage that I have here are from pools and DE fights from Derek Ray. Now, Derek is a very particular high-level fencer who is left-handed and has a very unique set of techniques that he uses to win tournaments. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at several exchanges from both pools and DEs where Derek was using two different fetters. One, a Cavetin that was a little bit longer and a little bit heavier, and the other, a Regenier that was a little bit shorter and a little bit faster. And the idea is we're going to watch some of the similar techniques that Derek always uses in his fights and see if the fetter made any noticeable difference in their execution and whether or not they were successful. So to get us into this, what we are going to look at here are three different exchanges that all feature the same technique, the left side Zornhau. And if you want to identify Derek Ray in every single one of them, he is the left-handed person in the purple and gray jacket. But one thing to note is that a left side Zornhau is going to behave very differently for a left-handed person than it is for most other people. Namely, that you can perform the left-handed Zornhau with your left-handedness with your hands uncrossed. And that's a very, very key important detail here, because it allows Derek to put up his best and most structured cut behind the attack of all of his right-handed opponents. All of the people in this, of course, fighting against him are going to be right-handed. And the three people are Jeff Will, Sam Riles, and Brandon Zipplinger. And there's actually a bit of an interesting interaction here where Derek very intentionally used a shorter fetter against Jeff and Brandon, but used a longer fetter against Sam. And there's some very interesting interactions in how all three of these exchanges played out that helps you understand some of the advantages and disadvantages of a longer versus shorter fetter. So, looking at the first one, we see an exchange with Jeff Will. And remember, this is with the short fetter. One thing you're going to notice is that that short fetter obviously comes into play when Derek, who throws his left Zornhau and completely pushes Jeff off to the side, manages to actually come up a little bit short, cleave into kind of like the upper trap muscle of Jeff, and then turn that cut into a thrust as Jeff's continued forward momentum starts bending the blade. Now, I'm not going to say that this was intentionally going to be a thrust, but it turned into one due to, of course, the fact that the fetter, given that it was like 1 or 2 inches shorter than his other one, managed to come in and get stuck here, at which point it could be turned into a thrust. Now, is this an advantage? Well, no. Being able to turn a cut into a thrust doesn't actually change, most of the time, the point differential or the value of the technique that you're executing. And of course, a Zornhau, while it can be turned into a thrust if it manages to fall short, it's generally not the intention of anyone throwing a Zornhau to make them short on purpose. So you can say here that this was just a happy little accident. But there is another feature of the faster sword, or the shorter sword, that came into play here, and that was the speed at which Derek could bring his left Zornhau to bear against Jeff Will's Shieldhau. If you know anything about Jeff Will, and he's been on the channel before, he throws a really mean and a really fast, very vertical Shieldhau. And one of the advantages of a very fast, very vertical Shieldhau is that you have to cross from the left side to the right side in order to windshield wiper it completely out of presence. The left side Zornhau, therefore, has to be very, very fast if it is going to get that attack out of presence. And if you're using a shorter fetter, generally what happens is that it's also lighter, but its point of balance is closer towards the grip of the sword, which allows you for better maneuverability in the cut. This faster maneuverability might have played a very vital effort in making sure that Derek was able to zone out the attack that was coming towards his head. Looking at the second exchange against Sam Riles, we have to remember that this was with a longer Fetter, and we can again see one of the effects of the longer Fetter here. Now, while this exchange was a little bit different, Derek is now the aggressor and Sam is the one throwing the counter hand shot, you can see a similar sort of interaction where Derek's left Zornhau comes across the middle, manages to push what was either a hand shot or maybe even a little bit of a thrust off to the side, and then comes crashing through towards the head of Sam, giving Derek some points. Now, what advantages did the longer Fetter potentially give him? Well, for one, it didn't get turned into a thrust because it came up short, but we could also maybe ascribe that to the fact that Derek was the one coming forward this time. But one advantage of a longer Fetter is that A, it's longer, so just in case you're not quite at the correct distance, it can give you that extra inch or two to actually reach your target. But also, more importantly, it's longer, it's heavier, and its point of balance is a little bit further forward. And most people attribute a further point of balance to the feeling or the better feeling of cuts. Now, this is a bit of a difference between the shorter Fetter where I said that the cuts were faster. In this case, the cuts are going to be that little bit slower, but they're going to be heavier. And one of the instances of any left Zornhau is how it interacts in the bind. The bind meaning that when two swords lock, what position they are in and how much momentum is behind them is often going to determine whether or not you are able to completely zone out your opponent's attack. So, if you are using a longer Fetter, you could say that it is going to be very advantageous in the Zornhau in the way that it is able to push your opponent's blades out of the way. But now, coming to the third exchange, we have a third outcome. We have one in which Derek was once again using a shorter sword, and one in which we see that the shorter blade did not give him an advantage. You can see that Brandon is the one coming in as the aggressor this time. Derek parries a left side kind of hand attack, and then immediately throws his left Zornhau as a counterattack. In this case, it's a little bit more like a left Zverkow, but at the end of the day, because we know what he's going for, we can say that this is a similar application of the same technique. However, this time, it doesn't look like he makes any contact at all. And one of the reasons you can say that this happens is that because his sword was just a little too short. Despite the fact that it came out very fast and very effectively and had absolutely no opposition, he just didn't make it to his target because his sword wasn't long enough, or at the very least, his hands were not extended enough. Normally, when a right-handed person throws a left side technique, their crossed hands result in their range being significantly shorter. But in this case, because Derek is left-handed, he was taking full advantage of the reach of his hands, it just wasn't quite enough. But what conclusions can we really draw here? Well, we can see a couple instances where a left side Zornhau, given that it is intended to be a cut, and most importantly, a counter-cutting action against opposition, we can see advantages and disadvantages for a short or longer Fetter in both cases. We can see one case where the shorter Fetter moves a little bit faster, which can mean that you can get your cut on target more effectively, but at the same time, that shortened range means that sometimes you end up having to perhaps overreach or overextend your own arms in order to make sure that it lands. At the same time, though, the longer Fetter looks like it has a bit of an advantage in how it can crash through your opponent's guard or a counterattack and make it a little bit more effective as a piece of bind work. But at the same time, a longer and heavier Fetter is going to be slower, which means it might not be as effective to throw these counter Zorn attacks as a counterattack or as a parry riposte. So on the whole here, with these particular examples, we don't have a really firm conclusion. So while we weren't really able to get any good conclusions out of the previous set of techniques, we might get something better out of this one. And in this particular instance, what we are seeing here is Derek Ray's response to mid-game pressure. Now, one thing that happens all the time, regardless of whether or not you're being defensive or aggressive, is that oftentimes the first attack just doesn't quite land, at which point you end up in a mid-range because somebody probably closed in and the other person didn't back up far enough that you reset back to long range. And in this mid-range game, many people, and Derek Ray included, rely on their Zverkows to get them out of them. Now, Zverkows are a very particular technique that has a very distinct set of advantages and disadvantages depending on a shorter or longer Fetter, and you can see those three instances play out here. So in this first example, Derek is throwing the technique. He gets parried, but he is able to pull off of that technique very, very quickly, especially because of the shortness of his fetter. Now, despite the fact that his fetter is a little bit short, he was still able to use his footwork to get in a little bit deeper, throw a follow-up cut to the body, and then use his footwork again to try to exit. And this is a pretty clear example of the kinds of advantages that short swords have in this mid-range game. In the mid-range game, everybody is going weak to strong, strong to weak, because anytime you throw an attack, you're going to be using the weak of your sword or the middle of your sword to try to hit some kind of target, and anytime someone is going to parry that close to their own body, you know that they're going to parry with the strong of their blade. Now, normally, the idea of a longer fetter would be that you would be able to crush through some of these, but you're never, no matter how heavy your sword is, going to be able to crush through the strong of somebody else's blade. A shorter fetter, therefore, is going to be able to take advantage of the fact that you can throw multiple attacks in succession, and as long as you have the footwork to compensate, you are always going to be able to get in, get out, and hit as quickly as your hands and feet allow. Now, for the next example against Sam Riles, Derek is using the longer blade, and we can see again how this particular sort of execution might have had a bit of a flaw. Derek parries a hand shot down low and attempts to come up high for, I think again, was going to be one of his left side Zornhaus, but due to the bind that he was in when he parried that one attack, he was not able to get his blade into presence fast enough to actually counterattack the follow-up mid-range shot that Sam was already throwing at his head. Now, in this particular instance, I believe both of these fencers are using longer blades, but you can see already just how much that little bit of speed can emphasize a mid-range gain. Derek, who is using a longer blade than perhaps he is really want to use, was not able to use that speed and use that follow-up game in that mid-range to effectively throw a counterattack or a counter parry, and was simply hit in the head before his hands could reach the desired position. A longer blade is also going to be a little bit floppier, and one thing that people don't talk about a lot is that floppiness essentially means that your blade is doing this in the air and exerting all kinds of weird forces on your blade and on your hands that you don't necessarily intend to do. So when you throw a big parry and you don't necessarily get down into that deep strong of your blade, you can often get a lot of vibration. And so when you parry something with a longer blade and it hits kind of the middle or the weak, your blade's suddenly going to start flexing all over the place, and it's going to heavily influence your ability to counterattack. So while they might have better blade presence when you get them in the right spot, if you get them in the wrong spot, a longer and more flexible blade is going to give you a little bit of a disadvantage in your parry riposte game. But now for the third exchange, we see another outcome, one in which Derek was again using the shorter blade, but was unable to do the kinds of fast, rapid-fire Zwerkaus that he looked like he was attempting to do in this. But the question is why? And the answer is because it has absolutely nothing to do with the blade and had everything to do with the grapple. Now, one thing about whenever two people meet in a mid-range game is that it's possible to start grappling people. And one of the things about grappling is that any amount of pressure that you can put onto the hands of your opponent is going to slow down their response no matter what. The only issue is that in order to put pressure on their hands, you usually have to do so with your own hands. And we see a perfect example and execution of this by Brandon Zipplinger in this exchange. Derek goes in, he gets up into a high bind, and you can see his intent is to zwerk all the way around to the other side and try to hit Brandon on the left side of his head. However, as this is happening, you can see that Brandon is putting an immense amount of pressure forward and a little bit down with his own hands onto Derek's hands. And as a result, that follow-up Zwerkau that comes all the way around to the other side looks like it's slowed down pretty significantly. Now, in this particular instance, the length of the blade or the heft of the blade just doesn't really come into factor at all. This exact kind of technique probably would have gone the exact same way regardless of whether or not the fetter was short or long. However, the important thing to consider here is that the shortness of the fetter normally would give you an advantage in this particular instance, but there is a way to shut down that advantage. And it's important for you to know that if you're going to be picking a fetter based on the kinds of techniques that you want to interact with or the techniques that you throw best, you have to always know that the length of the fetter is not going to help you if your opponent uses the counter to the technique that you want to use. So conclusions on these three sets of techniques are a little bit more clear than before. Shorter blades have a significant advantage when it comes to the mid-range Zverkow game, and we can see a pretty clear instance in all three of these. The longer Fetter clearly slowed Derek down in the exchange against Sam Rouse, and clearly sped him up in the two exchanges, one against Jeff and one against Brandon, even though the one against Brandon didn't end up working out perhaps the way that he intended. So if you're looking to try to execute a really effective mid-range game, having a shorter Fetter is likely going to help you. So this next technique is going to look a little bit similar to the left Zornhau, but in my opinion, it's a very different technique, but it's also got a very importantly different setup. And this technique is sort of a left side undercut to the hands, or if you want to really be, persistent about it, you could call it a Handedrücken, which is basically just the German word for hand slice or hand slice push. But the important aspect of this is that in both of these instances, and I don't have one for Jeff Will here, is that Derek manages to get underneath, cut upwards, and use the left side and the left-handedness of his fencing style to push his opponent's hands out of the way while simultaneously hitting them in the hands. And normally, this would be virtually impossible to do for a right-handed person because their crossed hands would shorten their range too much, and they wouldn't really have the same kind of leverage. But because Derek is able to push from the backside forward, he is able to more effectively defend himself simultaneously and hit his opponents in the hands. And you can see that play out both of these two times. In both instances, Derek's opponent comes forward with a big heavy attack. Derek is able to get underneath of it with his left hands and get up into the underside of, in both cases, his opponent's right hand. At the exact same time as he does this, he puts a lot of forward pressure and momentum and structure behind it to ensure that the attack that they are throwing isn't really able to reach its intended target. But what does this have to do with short or long Fetters? And in my opinion, nothing. But what it does have to do with is the setup for these two things. And the setup has to do with the concept of Fühlen, or the ability to feel another person's intent in the bind. Now, for this first instance, what we have here is Sam coming forward with a little bit of a feinted high cut in which he turns into a left side Zverkow. At the exact same time, Derek throws the left undercut of his own, and he's able, at least it looks like for me, able to zone out Sam's countercut by turning his undercut into a left side to right side push. And one of the instances that I talked about with the setup here is that one of the instances where a short or long Fetter can really be important is your ability to pull out of one execution and turn them into another. Now, on the one hand, having a bigger and longer and heavier and further point of balance Fetter could give you a really distinct advantage in the Handedrücken, in the hand push here, because it's giving you much more blade presence to physically put behind your structure or in front of your structure, and it's going to give you that slight bit of advantage just in terms of sheer weight and your ability to shove someone else's hands off to the side. However, in my opinion, this particular instance shows actually one of the weaknesses of the longer Fetter here. When we watch this exchange with Sam, you can see that Derek gets just as much tied up by this technique as Sam does. And while he does manage to pull it off, in my mind, successfully, it does show you just how much effort it takes to shove that longer, heavier blade directly into someone's hands and still be able to do something with that. Now, compare and contrast that to the execution that we see with Brandon Zipplinger. We have a little bit of an exchange here, but the point that I want to really showcase is that the Handedrücken that Derek is doing here in a very similar sort of instance does not have that same amount of effort and that same amount of push, and instead it utilizes the chess-like maneuverability of the line. Now, what happens here is that Derek threw a attack towards Brandon's head, and it got parried, at which case he dips his blade underneath and puts it on, basically very gingerly, places it onto the hands of his opponent. At which point, when Brandon goes to throw a Zverkow on the other side of his body, that little bit of position means that he is actually almost unable to maneuver his hands to the position he wants them to be in to throw his follow-up cut without dragging them against the blade of his opponent. In my opinion, this little Zverkow to the hands was not percussive enough to be a real cut. However, the next thing that happens is he can apply that similar amount of left side structure and pressure exactly in the way that a right side person could put on their dominant side. And that right side or left to right side pressure is able to knock Brendan a little bit off balance in his hands in order to stuff that left Zverkow that he was trying to throw just enough that he gets the slice. Now, what does the light Fetter or the short Fetter have to do with this? And it has everything to do with that little bit of maneuverability he gained from going from throwing an attack to placing his sword onto the hands of his opponent. This is a very, very precise thing to do, and one that I imagine would be significantly harder if your blade was a little bit longer and a little bit heavier. At the exact same time, we can also see that the kind of pressure you need to apply in order to set someone's hands off sides and get them into that kind of stuffed hand slice scenario doesn't actually require the heft and the length and the forward point of balance that a longer Fetter would give you. You can apply that pressure effectively with a shorter Fetter, even towards the mid or even the weak of your blade, so long as you know that the stuffing action isn't going to come in the form of force that physically stops their hands, but a presence of blade that's going to make them aware that they're slicing their own hands, and also the fact that the further away you are when you perform this slice, the more likely you're going to be able to put your blade and the rest of your strong into a defensive position. So in my opinion, this particular application and this particular technique gets a significantly better advantage from the shorter and faster Fetter. Now, one thing I made clear at the beginning of all this is that we had to make sure to understand that all of these conclusions that are being drawn for the very, very specific interactions that we see from Derek. This is not just an understanding of what makes a shorter Fetter or a longer Fetter better overall, but the shorter or better Fetter for Derek specifically and the techniques that he likes to use. So if you want to draw conclusions overall from this video, you have to be able to go back and watch your own footage, see the kinds of techniques that you like to use, and then decide for yourself whether or not a longer or shorter Fetter would be of benefit to you. Overall, there are some instances where a shorter or a longer Fetter has clear-cut advantages. The longer Fetter is almost always going to be better in long-distance thrust game, but that's not a game that we saw from Derek in these fights. The shorter Fetter is almost always going to be faster in the cut game, but it's going to have a disadvantage in your ability to throw one-handed techniques. Derek didn't really throw many one-handed techniques, but you might. You might love point work. You might love fighting from plow. And in those instances, you might have completely different conclusions about which kind of Fetter you want to use. So if you want to pick it, again, you have to watch your own footage, or you could send it over to me at HEMAFightBreakdowns@gmail.com, and I will review your footage for you, and maybe in the course of reviewing one of your fights, I'll give you a recommendation for what kind of sword you might want to use. Or I'll just tell you what your techniques could be better at. But if you want to see a video like that, feel free to send me some footage, or I will see you at Thursday.